Screeching tires tore through the still air, followed by the wail of a fire engine siren and a chorus of shouted curses. The truck swerved, its lights reflecting off suburban windows as it came to an abrupt, stuttering halt in front of a luxurious beige SUV parked squarely in what should have been a clearly marked fire lane. The firefighters leaped out, hoses in hand, adrenaline pumping, only to freeze. There were no red curb markings, no painted warnings, just smooth top paint, and a sign nearby that now read, "Reserved for HOA guests only." Inside a nearby home, a woman in a floral robe was sipping iced tea smugly on her porch. I watched the chaos unfold from my front lawn, jaw clenched, rage bubbling just under the surface. That fire lane used to be bright red. I know because I painted it myself when I was 12, next to my father, the fire chief. And now, thanks to HOA Karen and her brush of doom, someone's life might hang in the balance because a woman didn't like the color red. It had all started a week ago. I first noticed something strange when I took out the trash and found a crew of people with paint rollers kneeling near the curb. The fire lane, which had been marked clearly for years, was being coated over in beige. Not just any beige. This was the kind of lifeless, HOA-approved shade that screamed both boredom and passive aggression. At the center of it all stood Karen, the self-appointed president of our HOA, dressed in a sun hat that looked more like a solar panel and barking instructions like she was commanding a fleet. I asked what they were doing. She gave me a dismissive glance and said, "Improving the aesthetics of the neighborhood. Red is too aggressive. It stresses people out." I reminded her that it was a fire lane, that it had legal importance, that it had saved lives. She didn't care. "There's never been a fire here," she said, her voice as syrupy as it was condescending. "It's just taking up valuable guest parking space." I blinked at her. Was she seriously suggesting she had jurisdiction over emergency access? I told her firmly but politely that covering a fire lane was not only reckless, it was illegal. She scoffed and asked if I was threatening her. I wasn't, but I wished I had been. I went straight to the HOA office the next morning and filed a formal complaint. I even included a copy of the city ordinance about fire lanes, printed in full color, highlighted, and annotated. Karen responded with a mass email to the community accusing certain residents of trying to sabotage the beautification of the neighborhood and encouraging people to attend her Community Paint and Prosecco event where they'd finish repainting the curbs. She even promised wine and snacks. I stared at the email in disbelief. She had turned code violation into a cocktail party. I debated getting the city involved right then and there, but part of me still thought logic might prevail. Maybe someone on the HOA board would see reason. That hope died the next evening when I walked past the party and saw half a dozen homeowners, tipsy and cheering as they rolled paint over the last remaining red stripe. One guy joked about how he felt like Banksy. Karen raised her glass and toasted to clean pallets and clean parking. I turned and walked away, hands shaking. I didn't even know how to explain this to my dad without his blood pressure spiking, so I didn't. Not yet. 2 days later, I sent another warning email. No response. I contacted the city fire marshal, but due to red tape and an upcoming inspection tour, they said they'd need a week to send someone. And that's when fate decided to fast forward the lesson Karen so desperately needed to learn. It was the 4th of July weekend, and the neighborhood was hosting its annual cookout. Someone set up a grill too close to a bush. A breeze picked up. One spark landed in the dry mulch lining the HOA clubhouse, and the flames took off like they'd been waiting for the cue. People started screaming and running. Someone knocked over a bucket of beer trying to douse the flames, which of course did nothing. I ran toward the smoke, yelling for people to clear the area. I called 911 and directed the fire department to the scene. They were there within minutes, but not at the fire. They were stuck, unable to reach the blaze because of Karen's SUV parked exactly where the fire lane used to be marked. I ran to meet the truck, pointing furiously. "This is the fire lane. You can go through here." But they hesitated. No red curb. No signage. No clearance. One firefighter shouted, "We can't risk it unless it's marked. We'll go around." They had to backtrack around 2 blocks, losing nearly 6 minutes. By the time they made it to the source, a shed had caught fire, and embers were beginning to float dangerously close to someone's roof. The firefighters leaped into action, but it was clear this was worse than it ever needed to be. I stood in the middle of the chaos, watching Karen stumble out of her house barefoot, shrieking something about her porch decorations melting. She locked eyes with me and opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off with a single sentence. "This is on you." She looked around, suddenly realizing her actions had gone from petty HOA nonsense to literal endangerment. 10 minutes later, as the fire was extinguished and the property damage assessed, I saw my dad walking up the street in his fire chief uniform, grim as a thundercloud. He took one look at the covered fire lane, then at Karen's vehicle, then at me. "Is this what I think it is?" he asked. I nodded. He turned and barked to his team, "Get the photos. This isn't over." Karen, flustered, tried to approach him. "Chief, I was only trying to improve the curb appeal. We never expected a fire." He didn't even glance her way. Instead, he walked straight to the SUV and pulled out his phone. "City code violation. Obstruction of emergency response. Civil fine incoming." And that's just the beginning. The firefighters stood nearby, silently watching her unravel. She tried to laugh it off. "It's just paint. It can be fixed." One firefighter replied flatly, "Tell that to the couple who lost their shed and almost their dog." Karen's face drained of color. As the crowd dispersed, I finally exhaled. The damage could have been worse, but the reckoning had just begun. Karen had unknowingly crossed the one person in this neighborhood who not only knew every fire code by heart, but who was born into the very job of enforcing them. She had painted over the fire lane. Now it was time to paint over her presidency. The morning after the fire was a strange mix of smoke, tension, and cheap plastic flags fluttering limply from fences that had almost gone up in flames. The air still smelled of charred wood and overcooked burgers. Everyone was rattled, but no one more than Karen, who had vanished inside her house the night before and hadn't been seen since. Her SUV had been quietly moved in the middle of the night, almost like she was trying to erase the evidence, but the neighborhood had already seen everything. And so had the fire department. Photos had been taken, videos were circulating, and word was spreading faster than the flames had. The incident wasn't just a neighborhood story anymore. It was now a matter of public safety and, more importantly, liability. And I knew Karen's carefully curated world was about to unravel. I was sitting on my porch, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, when my dad pulled up in his fire department SUV. His jaw was clenched tight, and his usual calm demeanor had a razor-sharp edge to it. He had spent most of the night filing incident reports, coordinating with city officials, and trying to get ahead of the inevitable media storm. He didn't even greet me with a good morning. He just walked up the steps and said, "It's worse than we thought. She's not just a nuisance. She's criminally negligent." I nodded. I didn't need convincing. He sat beside me and pulled out a folder filled with documentation. Photos of the painted-over curbs, drone footage showing the blocked access, timestamps from the fire truck GPS, and statements from multiple firefighters. It was damning, and then he handed me a copy of the HOA bylaws. Karen had added a handwritten note in one section, attempting to grant the HOA authority to revise curb colors for aesthetic harmony. It was signed only by her, dated a week before the painting spree began. Not a single board member had co-signed. Apparently, Karen had taken liberties, thinking her title gave her absolute power. She'd essentially altered governing documents with no oversight. My dad shook his head and muttered, "People like her don't understand consequences until it's their wallet or their reputation burning." He stood up and added, "There's a city council meeting on Thursday. Be there." Then he left, driving off towards City Hall like a storm cloud on wheels. That afternoon, an emergency HOA meeting was announced. The message came from Karen's email address, but the tone was far more frantic than usual. It said the meeting was mandatory, would address misunderstandings related to safety protocols, and would provide clarity moving forward. I couldn't help but laugh. She was scrambling. By 7 o'clock, the clubhouse was packed. Most of the neighbors looked furious or confused. Some were whispering about fines, insurance hikes, and rumors that the fire marshal himself was getting involved. Karen strutted in last, wearing a pantsuit that looked like she'd borrowed it from a used car commercial and a fake calm that cracked around the edges. She started with a speech about how she had only ever tried to do what's best for the neighborhood. Her voice trembled slightly as she mentioned overreactions and personal vendettas. When she tried to claim that the fire lane wasn't marked properly to begin with, 3 separate residents stood up and shouted her down, one even pulling out a printed photo from last year's block party showing the red curb clearly visible. Then I stood up. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. I just handed her a letter. It was a formal notice of violation issued by the city, signed and stamped. She stared at it like it might catch fire in her hands. As the room fell quiet, a man from the back stepped forward. I didn't recognize him at first, but then I realized it was Doug, the HOA's vice president. He usually stayed quiet and avoided conflict, but tonight something had changed. Doug cleared his throat and said, "I think it's time we talk about the emails." That got everyone's attention. Karen froze. Doug pulled out a stack of papers and began reading. They were private messages from Karen, forwarded to his account by mistake. In one of them, she openly bragged about neutralizing the fire lane to open up VIP parking, and mocked anyone who would freak out over a little paint. She even mentioned that she hoped someone would try to challenge her so she could shut them down and show them who's in charge. Gasps echoed through the room. Karen's face turned pale. She accused Doug of betrayal. Doug responded by announcing his resignation from the HOA board, effective immediately, and advised the remaining members to seek legal counsel. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Some residents demanded her immediate removal. Others were too stunned to speak. Karen stormed out, knocking over a folding chair as she left. The next morning, city vehicles arrived. A team of inspectors measured curb distances, photographed every altered paint job, and recorded interviews with neighbors. It was official. The city was launching a full code review of the neighborhood. And the insurance company? They weren't far behind. Apparently, news of the fire and the blocked access had reached the company's risk assessment division. There was talk of policy rate increases across the entire subdivision unless Karen was removed from her position and the damage was reversed. Karen tried to retaliate, of course. She sent out another email blast claiming she was the victim of a coordinated smear campaign. She accused me of manipulating the fire department and even said my dad had used his position to intimidate a civilian. But no one was buying it anymore. Screenshots of her previous messages were making their way around the neighborhood group chat. Someone even started printing them and taping them to lampposts like wanted posters. I got a call from the city council clerk asking if I would be willing to testify during the upcoming safety hearing. I said yes immediately. Karen might have started this with a paintbrush, but now it was my turn to repaint the entire narrative with facts, witnesses, and public accountability. She underestimated me because she thought I was just another homeowner, but I wasn't just anyone. I was the fire chief's daughter, and I wasn't done yet. 2 days before the city council hearing, our once quiet neighborhood looked like a war zone of bureaucracy. Orange cones lined the curbs, temporary no parking signs were staked into the ground every few yards, and a steady stream of city workers moved through with measuring wheels, cameras, and clipboards. Karen's kingdom of beige order was unraveling, and she couldn't stop it. Every time I looked out the window, I saw another resident stepping outside, whispering with a neighbor, shaking their head, or snapping photos. The HOA board group chat, usually filled with reminders about lawn care and bird feeders, was now flooded with demands for Karen's resignation, screenshots of her emails, and links to city ordinances she had blatantly violated. Karen, however, hadn't gone down quietly. In fact, she doubled down. She tried calling an emergency board meeting, but no one showed. She called the city office claiming harassment. She even hired a private contractor to repaint one of the side curbs back to beige in the dead of night. Unfortunately for her, the contractor didn't realize a city inspector was watching from across the street during a routine inspection sweep. The contractor was fined on the spot, and the city filed an additional complaint for tampering with active municipal enforcement. By the next morning, Karen's name was being spoken in hushed tones by HOA members, not out of respect, but to avoid being associated with her train wreck of leadership. Meanwhile, I had spent the last 48 hours helping the city's fire code review team gather statements. My dad provided internal documentation showing how Karen's interference had delayed emergency response. Several firefighters gave written accounts of the blocked lane and its impact. One neighbor, whose dog had nearly died from smoke inhalation, wrote a gut-wrenching letter describing how helpless they felt while waiting for the fire truck to get through. The case was no longer just about HOA rules. It was about public endangerment. Karen had messed with the wrong curb and the wrong person. On the morning of the hearing, I walked into City Hall wearing a simple blue blazer and holding a folder thick with evidence. The hearing room was packed. Reporters stood at the back with cameras. A few local news anchors were already whispering to their mix as if they were about to break news of a corruption scandal. Karen sat in the front row wearing a neck brace that had mysteriously appeared overnight, clearly trying to milk some sympathy. Her face was a mix of smugness and desperation, and she kept dabbing her eyes with a tissue despite not shedding a single actual tear. The first part of the hearing involved a presentation from the city's fire department. My dad stepped up, cool and professional, and laid out the timeline of the July 4th fire. Photos were shown of the painted-over fire lane, the blocked truck, the delay in access, and the damage to the property. The council members watched in stunned silence. When he finished, Karen stood up to interject, claiming she had unofficial approval to repaint for aesthetic purposes. One of the council members raised an eyebrow and asked, "From whom?" She stammered, mentioned a vague conversation with an HOA member who was supportive, then sat back down when the silence became unbearable. Next, Dove, the now resigned vice president, was called to speak. He brought the printed emails. He explained how Karen had operated unilaterally, ignoring procedure, manipulating documentation, and lying to the rest of the board. He testified that he'd warned her multiple times about the legal consequences of altering safety markings, but she dismissed him every time. Karen tried to interrupt again, claiming Doe was bitter about losing influence. He held up his city-issued commendation from a past fire response to shut her up, and the room even chuckled lightly. Then it was my turn. I stepped up, took a breath, and explained what happened from my perspective. I told them about seeing the curb being painted over, about my warnings to Karen, about the emails, about the HOA party with rollers and wine glasses. I emphasized that this wasn't just about neighborhood paint. It was about reckless leadership and the deliberate erasure of safety protocols that put lives at risk. I presented the complaint I'd filed, the screenshots, and the reports I'd collected from residents. I ended my testimony with a calm but firm statement. The only thing that burned faster than the fence that day was the trust in our HOA leadership. The room went silent. The council thanked me, and I sat down. Karen, however, wasn't done. She stood up, clutching a folder full of unrelated notes, and tried to make a speech about how difficult it was to be a woman in power. She blamed the stress of managing a chaotic board, slandered by residents with vendettas, and even said the fire wasn't that serious because only a shed was lost, not a house. That did it. One of the council women cut her off sharply and said, "A shed that contained explosive materials. That shed could have taken out 2 homes. You're lucky the dog survived." Karen sat down, face bright red, mumbling about her neck pain. The verdict came quickly. The city fined her for obstruction of emergency access, unpermitted curb alteration, and misuse of HOA authority. The HOA itself was placed under a temporary city oversight program. Karen was removed from her role pending further review, and the council issued a public advisory for all HOAs citywide to revisit their emergency access compliance. Karen tried to appeal, but her request was denied. The final insult came when she was ordered to assist, under city supervision, in repainting the curbs red again, every inch of them. As I left City Hall, several neighbors gathered around to thank me. One elderly woman squeezed my hand and whispered, "You saved someone's life, even if they don't realize it yet." That hit me hard. All I ever wanted was for people to take safety seriously. For someone like Karen, Appearances always came before substance, but now the only thing people saw when they looked at her was liability. That evening, I watched from my porch as city workers began restoring the fire lane. Bright red paint replaced the dull beige. Reflective tape was added for extra visibility. New signs were installed warning of fines and towing. Karen's SUV stayed parked in her driveway, quiet and untouched. She didn't come out. No more smug porch lounging. No more condescending speeches. Just silence. The neighborhood had changed, not in the way Karen wanted, but in the way it needed. People were finally paying attention, not to the color of the curb, but to what it meant: safety, responsibility, and accountability. And for the first time in weeks, I slept without grinding my teeth. The red line was back, and this time it wouldn't be erased. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had transformed into something almost unrecognizable, not because of new buildings or landscaping, but because people were finally seeing through the beige-tinted lies Karen had painted over everything for years. Her grasp on control had cracked, and the fragments were being swept away faster than she could scramble to pick them up. But I wasn't done. Karen had done more than block a fire lane. She had deliberately endangered lives and manipulated authority like it was her personal crafting project. And while the city had issued its rulings and the HOA had finally pushed her aside, I wanted something more lasting. Not revenge, just a lesson burned into memory so clearly that no one would dare forget it again. The first phase of what I jokingly called Project Red Line began with coordination between the fire department and the city's public works crew. But this time it wasn't just about repainting a few red curbs. I had asked the city to install reflective warning panels that would flash if a car blocked the fire lane. They agreed, noting this neighborhood was now a case study in how rapidly things could spiral due to unchecked HOA overreach. The curbs weren't just painted. They were lacquered with heat-resistant, fade-resistant industrial red. Bold enough to be visible from orbit. At least that's how the firefighters joked as they watched it being applied. When the signs went up, they weren't subtle. They had LED strips that blinked in red and white and read "Fire Lane. Violators will be towed. No exceptions." Below that, a new line was added: City Supervised Compliance Zone. The HOA board approved it with only one person abstaining, Karen, who now had no vote, no authority, and no sympathy. She didn't even attend the meetings anymore. Her porch had become a no-go zone, where once she waved at every jogger like a politician on parade, she now drew her blinds closed at the sound of approaching footsteps. But then came the day she cracked. It started small. A neighbor parked a little too close to the edge of her driveway, and Karen came storming out of her house, yelling about property boundaries and code violations. Only this time, her shouting was met with silence, then soft laughter. The neighbor calmly pointed at the curb. It was painted red, clearly, legally, backed by the city and the fire department. Karen stammered, waved her arms in protest, and finally stormed back inside, slamming her door so hard a plastic wreath fell off. That same evening, I hosted a gathering, not in retaliation, but as a way to shift the community energy towards something positive. It was a fire safety night, co-hosted with the fire department. We brought out one of the trucks, handed out little plastic helmets to the kids, and offered hot dogs and lemonade. I gave a short speech about what happened and why fire lanes matter, using the incident not as a point of shame, but as a chance to educate. People clapped, cheered, and even thanked me for standing up when no one else had wanted to get involved. Several admitted they'd been intimidated by Karen's pushy nature and were relieved to see someone finally put her in check. The event ran longer than expected, and as the sun set and the curb lights flickered on, the newly restored fire lane glowed bright red beneath the street lamps, like a badge of honor. The next day, Karen made one last attempt to claw back relevance. She posted a handwritten letter on the community bulletin board near the mailbox cluster. It was 6 paragraphs of dramatic prose, blaming the Anti-Karen Coalition, accusing the city of harassment, and declaring herself the only one with the vision to keep the neighborhood tasteful. She also claimed the LED lights on the fire lane signs were an eyesore causing her migraines and requested they be removed for the good of public health. The letter was taken down within hours, not by me, by Doug. and in its place, someone taped a printed version of her VIP parking email, now laminated and titled Exhibit A. Leadership failure. That same evening, I received a call from the city compliance officer. They had concluded the full review of the HOA's actions and, as a result, were requiring mandatory fire safety training for all HOA members and board appointees. Karen would be required to attend every session or face personal fines. The irony of her being forced to sit through lectures about the very regulations she tried to erase was too poetic to ignore. I didn't smile out of pettiness. I smiled because maybe, just maybe, this would be what finally made her understand the gravity of what she had done. A week later, I stood in the back of the community room where the first fire safety session was held. Karen sat in the front row, arms crossed, visibly seething but saying nothing. The instructor, a no-nonsense firefighter named Jules, clicked through a slideshow showing real incidents where fire lanes had saved lives or where their absence had caused tragedy. Karen flinched when our own neighborhood fire photo came up. Jules didn't name names, but the entire room shifted uncomfortably. It was one thing to hear about fire safety in the abstract. It was another thing entirely to see your own curb on a city case study slide. After the session ended, several residents approached me quietly to say thank you. A few even apologized for not speaking up earlier when they saw Karen covering the curb. I told them it wasn't about blame anymore. It was about prevention. Mistakes can happen, but silence makes them fatal. Before I left, I caught Karen's eye. She looked away, not out of shame but avoidance, the kind that comes from someone who knows they've lost power and has nothing left to lean on. The next morning, a truck pulled up to Karen's house. It was her landscaping crew, but instead of unloading tools, they began removing her porch furniture, wind chimes, and those hideous plastic flower baskets she loved. Rumors spread fast. Karen was moving. Not permanently, maybe just to another property she owned in a nearby community, but it was clear she was done here. Her reputation, her credibility, and her influence had all burned away without a single match ever being struck. When she finally drove off, I didn't wave. No one did, but we didn't celebrate either. This wasn't a victory parade. It was more like the quiet relief of putting out a fire before it reached the roof. Karen had tried to paint over rules, but now her actions were permanently etched into the history of this neighborhood. And the curb, that glowing red line, would always remind everyone of what happens when vanity tramples over safety and one stubborn resident pushes too far. The line was no longer just red paint. It was the symbol of a community that had finally learned how to stand up. The city hearing might have wrapped up with an official verdict, but for me, the true conclusion came weeks later when the neighborhood stopped whispering and started laughing again. Slowly but surely, the fear that Karen's shadow had cast over everything began to fade, replaced by something lighter, more communal. People who had once avoided neighborhood events started showing up again. The lawn chairs came out. Barbecues resumed. There was still tension in the air sometimes, the kind that lingers after any wildfire, literal or otherwise, but it was no longer smothering. It was part of the healing. The fire lane, now permanently marked and guarded with flashing lights and freshly installed no parking sensors, stood as a quiet but powerful symbol that this neighborhood had changed, and that when people stand together, even in the face of petty tyranny and beige power grabs, they can protect what really matters. I spent more time walking the block than I used to. People started waving again, calling out to say hello. Some of them even asked about fire safety tips, wondering if they had enough clearance around their houses or if they should replace their smoke detectors. It was surreal, the shift in energy. Once, I was the girl who kept pointing out violations and getting side eyes for it. Now I was the unofficial go-to for real answers, and not because I was my father's daughter or even because I had made a public stand. It was because I had told the truth and refused to back down when someone tried to erase it with a paint roller and a power trip. Karen, despite all her attempts to cling to relevance, had finally disappeared. Her house sold quietly, and the real estate listing didn't mention her name. It probably wouldn't have helped the value if it had. The new owners were a young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever, and within a week, their yard was filled with laughter and toys, not rules and restrictions. I ran into them on one of my walks. They had no idea about the saga that had unfolded on their front curb just months earlier, and I didn't tell them. Some stories don't need to be retold, especially when their ending has already shaped something better. Let the fresh start be just that, fresh. But the city didn't forget. The fire department turned our situation into a training module. My dad invited me to speak to new recruits, and I found myself standing in front of a classroom of young firefighters, telling them about the incident, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I showed them the before and after photos, the legal documents, the footage from the fire truck dash cams. I explained how something as simple as paint could be the difference between life and death when the clock is ticking. They listened. Some even asked for copies of my notes. It hit me then how far this had come, from a woman with a roller to a room of people who now understood why a curb matters. The city council also passed a motion that required all HOAs in the district to submit annual emergency access plans, reviewed directly by the fire department. That alone sparked a wildfire of reform across nearby communities. And not everyone was thrilled. Some HOAs grumbled about red tape, but others welcomed the oversight, realizing they'd been skating by with outdated, sloppy enforcement and unchecked power for far too long. My neighborhood, once the epicenter of conflict, became the model. The very thing Karen tried to bury in beige had become a beacon. Of course, not all changes came from policy. Some came from simple human action. Doug, the former HOA vice president, stepped up as interim president and brought actual transparency to the board. He opened meetings to anyone who wanted to attend. No more secret agendas or behind-the-scenes deals. When budget discussions came up, he shared them line by line. People didn't always agree, but for the first time, they felt heard. And when it came to repainting other shared spaces in the community, Doug didn't even choose the colors himself. He put up a board-wide poll, then made sure every paint change had a code-compliant sign-off. It was mundane stuff, but after months of chaos, mundane was a relief. For my part, I didn't take any official position. I wasn't interested in joining the HOA or managing meetings, but I did agree to become the community's emergency liaison, an informal role mostly involving keeping communication open with the fire department and making sure safety never got pushed to the background again. It wasn't about ego. It was about doing the thing that Karen never could, putting people first. Not paint, not appearance, just people. The best moment, though, came during the next annual block party. It was held on the wide cul-de-sac near the park, and for the first time in years, there were no arguments about folding chair placement or grill permits. Families brought dishes. Teenagers manned the lemonade stand. Even the fire department showed up, rolling in with a truck for the kids to explore. My dad stood next to me, arms crossed, watching the scene with a quiet pride. He didn't express much with words. He nudged me and said, "You did good, kid." I laughed and said, "We did." And no one tried to repaint anything. Then the mayor's office sent over a surprise. The city had created a new citizen recognition program called the Red Line Award. It was given to individuals who prevented a community hazard through personal initiative, and I was the first recipient. They handed me a small plaque, nothing flashy, just a simple piece of wood with a red strip across the top. But it meant something, not just to me but to everyone who had watched what happened and remembered why it mattered. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the fire lane's lights blinked gently in the background, I realized something. This whole ordeal hadn't just been about a painted curb. It had been about control and the illusion that rules don't apply when you think you're above them. Karen had believed she could erase danger with a roller, but in doing so, she revealed just how thin the veneer of control really is when people push back with truth, unity, and consequences. The curb would remain red. The signs would stay lit. The community had moved forward not by forgetting the past, but by learning from it. And as I looked around at the children chasing bubbles, the neighbors sharing stories, and the fire truck gleaming in the twilight, I felt it deep at my chest. The line was back, and this time it was never going away.